Howdy, welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. Got a little treat for everybody, I guess mainly for myself. Uh, you saw the title. We're going to be talking about the White Lotus Season 2 and its connection with the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover archetypes that we've been covering on the channel from Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. For those who are new to the channel, I make videos on good ideas. What's a good idea? Basically what I like. It's my channel. No, I think I have good taste when it comes to some great ideas, and my current rabbit hole of great ideas is archetypal psychology. So I've been tackling a few works so far. A book called Archetypes, aptly named, by Dr. Anthony Stevens, who lays the biological and psychological foundations for the archetypal theory, originally from Carl Jung. And then a continuation of that and more of an application of how archetypal psychology can help us as a tool for mental health in the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert L. Moore and Douglas Gillette. Both are being covered on the channel as we speak. So be sure and check those out if you find any of the following information interesting. And I have a lot of useful information in the description below, so check those out, just various links here and there. We got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to get right into it. Yeah, to start things off, we want to talk about what an archetype is. And when people hear that word, it's not really common knowledge, the kind of concept that comes to mind. It sounds kind of like new agey, hard to define. I mean, what is it really? Basically, the definition brought forth by Dr. Anthony Stevens, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's a biological predisposition in humans which biologically and psychologically prepares them for characteristic experiences that they'll go through. So some examples of this may be being mothered or being fathered, or going through grief, or initiation, or sacrifice. These are experiences that are universal, that are biologically hardwired, but manifest themselves psychologically. That was a mouthful, but check out my other videos. I do not have time to get into all the nuances on this video, but I highly encourage y'all to check those out for more information. And again, okay, I gotta say this. Don't take my word for anything. I'm not an expert on any of this. I'm learning this with y'all. I'm what you might call an enthusiastic fan. I think that the archetypal paradigm is a great tool we can use for self-knowledge. And greater self-knowledge is better mental health and makes our lives better and makes the lives of those around us better. So I think that's a worthwhile cause to get behind. And if there's a tool to help move that along, then I'm all for it. So we'll be talking about in this video the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover archetypes, and these are articulated by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette in the book of that name, and they're known as the masculine archetypes. To be clear, they are called masculine archetypes, but they exist in the feminine as well. And this comes from Jung again, Carl Jung, the anima and the animus. So men can learn about the feminine through their anima, and women can learn about their masculine through the animus. So the theory goes. In the same way, or in the same vein, women do have a king, warrior, magician, lover, masculine archetype, but they will only be accessing it secondarily through their animus. So the theory goes. There are feminine archetypes, but that is not the object of the video. That's for another time. Let me know if you all want me to talk about that. Think of the yin and yang symbol, basically. There's yin in the yang and yang in the yin, and all that. That's a good way to think about the paradigm here. And as in terms of what the king, warrior, magician, lover are, I've got videos on those. I'm going to talk about some of them here. Not so much the magician, as it's not the most relevant. But I will explain those archetypes as we move along through the characters and the season. Speaking of the season, I am not an expert on White Lotus season 2. I'm a casual viewer just like y'all. I didn't do a bunch of research for this video. I didn't dissect the lines. I didn't look into behind the scenes and what could have, all this stuff. I just watched it once. I enjoyed it. I give it a 9 out of 10. It's not this isn't a review, but that's where I stand on it. But I've been covering archetypal psychology on the channel, and when I watch this, I can't not see from that lens. And I mean, it's a good show. And what's neat is people could read into this show from a character study perspective or a class wealth kind of dichotomy reading on this, like socioeconomic. You could do a race thing. You could look at it from a manosphere perspective, there's beta males and alpha males here. But what I don't think is the paradigm I want to look at for now is coming at the season from an archetypal perspective, archetypal psychology perspective. I think there's some things to be said here. So let's start with the two couples, Harper and Ethan, and then Cameron and Daphne. And there's a lot to unpack. And I apologize. I'm going to be going pretty quickly. There's so much to cover. Again, let me know in the comments below what you'd like me to expound upon. I took a lot of notes, and I'm just scratching the surface. But I'm really excited. So yeah, that disclaimer out of the way. The first thing that, when watching the show, that becomes apparent between these two couples is that they're both complete opposites and yet both dysfunctional in some way. On the one hand, Harper and Ethan seem very authentic and have a tight bond. They have conversations, they can joke with each other, they have a routine. They're pretty content and they trust their partner, at least on the surface. And yet, there's a feeling of sterility and impotence. Especially, impotence may be the better word, given Ethan's proclivity for the porn addiction. Maybe not addiction, but habit. And yet, on the other hand, we'll get into more of that. But on the other hand, Cameron and Daphne are amorous, but shallow. So they don't really have a deep, tight bond like Harper and Ethan, but they're more like kids having fun, which is what's missing in the other. So from just a cinematic perspective, we can probably use our sixth sense to know there's probably going to be a reckoning when these opposites clash. And that there'll probably be lessons learned on both sides, which is kind of what happens. Maybe. It's left ambiguous at the end, as those who have seen it know. But I'll talk more about that later. So let's start with Ethan and Cameron, though. I think that's the most strong and obvious contrast in regards to the lover archetype. And I like to say I'm going to explain the archetypes as we move along, so bear with me. I will explain them to a sufficient degree, I hope. But I like to think that each of the archetypes asks a question. The king asks, what is the vision? The warrior asks, what is the vision asking of me to do to complete the vision? The magician asks, how are we going to do it? And the lover archetype asks, do we even want to do this? Like, the king is like, all right, we're going to build a house. The magician is like, okay, what are the blueprints? Like, how are we going to, what materials do we need? What permits do we need? The warrior is like, I'm ready to build. I'm going to grab the hammer and start nailing. Like, do I like the energy to build the house? And the lover, who often gets left out in the modern world, asks, wait a minute. We think we want a house. We're ready to build the house, and we know how to build the house. But do we even want a house? The lover asks, do we even want to do what we're doing? And I like this paradigm when it comes to Ethan and Cameron. So let's talk about, real quick. Yeah, the lover has to do with taking the pleasure out of life. Ethan and Cameron, we see in the former kind of an absence of the lover, and in the latter, in excess. Although in Cameron's case, I would say there's a bit of nuance because I actually think he's a narcissist, and that has to do with the king archetype, which we'll talk about in a bit. But let's talk about Ethan. He's obviously very smart, which has to do with the magician archetype. He built a business and sold it. Obviously very, smart. He's responsible, level-headed, ethical, and communicates well. Yes, the ambiguity at the end. Let's just say this. He strikes me, as somebody who's comfortable in his boundaries with an asterisk, who is capable of accomplishing what he needs to and puts energy into the things that he enjoys. The problem is, as Harper brings up, his wife, it's tough to figure out, does he really even enjoy his life? And this is very apparent in their relationship as Harper wonders, yeah, we get along. Yeah, we have a good bond. Yeah, our lives are going well. But do you even want me? That's a perfect lover archetype crying out, right? They're like machines executing all the right moves and yet taking no enjoyment out of anything. And I think that back to the asterisk and boundaries for Ethan, we'll get to that. So let's talk about the king. The king archetype is the most fundamental archetype. The king, think about the house example, right? None of the other archetypes can be mobilized if there isn't at first no idea of or vision in the first place. Like, what's the warrior going to do if he has no mission? What's the magician going to think about if there's no purpose to the thinking, if there's no volition to it? What is the lover going to do within the absence of a king? And we'll talk more about that too. I keep saying that, but like I said, this is jam-packed. But I'm trying to say, like, when the king archetype says, okay, we're going to build a house, the warrior's like, did I just hear a mission? Awesome. Now I have something to focus my energies on. The magician is like, oh, now I have a puzzle to solve. How best to build this house, right? The king creates the vision. The king sets the boundaries. And we're talking about the inner world and the outer world. Your boundaries with people, your boundaries in the physical world, all that. And we can see, now, a special note here, that the king does not defend his kingdom, okay? The king sets the boundaries, but the king does not defend his kingdom. That is the warrior's job. The warrior is the one who has the vigor and the energy and the ability to go out and defend the boundaries that the king sets. But if the king sets no boundaries, then there's no boundary for the warrior to defend, right? And again, we come to Ethan. Ethan knows his wife is his wife. He knows the difference between his wife and his friends and the hotel staff and acquaintances and all that. He has that basic, formula going. And yet, Cameron and Daphne are allowed to simply trample all over Ethan's boundaries and never stands up to them, really. And this is why Ethan appears to be so impotent and weak. He's he's a very accomplished and yet hollow kind of individual, kind of just blowing in the wind. Now, looking at my notes here. Right. So the thing is, Ethan's lack of exuberance, yes, is attributed to a lack of the lover within him, but there can only be a lack of the lover if there's a lack of the king also. Where there is a deficiency in a single one of the archetypes, a deficiency in a single one of the archetypes is a confession that there is a deficiency in the king. The other archetypes can only blossom as much as there is a kingdom for them to blossom within or as a part of. So, we know that there's a lack of warrior within. He seems to have accomplished a lot, but he can't even defend his own boundaries. He can't even summon the will to say, no, I don't think I want to, hang out tonight, Cameron and Daphne, or really dig into the issues with his wife at the beginning. And I believe that his character arc, to a significant degree, is him finding out what the hell his kingdom is and how he's going to defend it. So let's talk about Cameron from the same context. Now we're talking about an inflation of the king archetype. Whereas Ethan had kind of a deficiency where enemies were invading his kingdom all the time, Cameron, Ethan didn't know where his kingdom was, and Cameron doesn't know where his kingdom ends. And he constantly tramples over other people's boundaries, his wife, his friends, everybody. And Moore and Gillette talk about this kind of behavior in children, how children always want to be seen. Mommy and Daddy, take a look at what I did. Isn't that great? Oh, yes, that's great. And there's a thinker who I haven't covered, who I want to, Heinz Kohut, who talks about this kind of inflation, natural inflation in children, and it should be celebrated. But such behavior is unbecoming in adults, and it can become narcissism, which is what I think Cameron is. The definition of an inflated king archetype. So both the weakling king and the tyrant narcissist king, Moore and Gillette, call an inflation of the king a tyrant and the deflation of the king a weakling. They're both dysfunctions dysfunctional versions of the king archetype, but they're opposite in polarity. I do think it's very telling, though, that, and this is a very subtle point, that Cameron didn't really evolve. And I think we see this because he loses his temper quite a bit when his wife is nagging him to come visit the kids on the phone. That was my reading of it. And if that's true, then the show is communicating that it may be possible to reclaim the power of the king, but it may not be possible to let go of the inflation of the king. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, king, warrior, magician, and lover are masculine archetypes dictated by Robert L. Moore and Douglas Gillette. But I do want to talk about Daphne as well in this context. And I think she becomes surprisingly nuanced by the end of the season. On the one hand, she seems kind of the most content in a way, with an asterisk, a heavy asterisk. I would say morbidly content. And here's what I mean. That her king archetype, that which holds the vision of her life and what it can become, has been utterly demolished and dethroned by Cameron, who happens to be an expert in demolishing other people's kingdoms and boundaries. And the prime example here is the cheating, the definition of like a boundary breaching behavior. And I think it's tragic because she we get a sense that her king is still alive, yet it's maimed and wounded and small because she knows and confides in Harper what her existence has become. And she is obviously distraught about it, and even with Ethan at the end with the ambiguity in that scene. Like she knows her life, and she seems to have just accepted her fate. Her world is very, very, very small, which I think explains her shallow existence. And she knows it, but she can't escape, or she won't escape. She doesn't have the in the literature, it's called the constellation of the archetype, the manifestation of it. It hasn't been, the king is not constellated, and thus she has, her vision is impotent and she's stuck. Obviously, her warrior is shot. Maybe earlier in their relationship, she fought and resisted and tried to break out and change her life, but has just been beaten too many times. I'm just speculating here, but seems reasonable to me. I want to talk about another aspect related to Daphne, and this has to do with the lover archetype. Moore and Gillette talk about it having an outlaw quality, being that it's an outlaw compared to the other archetypes because it's the only one that seeks to expand boundaries. The king wants to define a vision. A warrior wants to go on one mission. A magician wants to just figure out one puzzle, right? But the lover, as Robert L. Moore says, just wants to lick everything. The lover will constantly experiment and it'll run wild. It just wants, to lick everything. It wants to experience everything. It can become pure hedonism. And the other archetypes serve to more restrain the lover and restrain in a healthy sense, to harness it, right? And I think of this outlaw quality when I think of Daphne, that hedonism and pleasure, speaking of her personal trainer, right? Maybe her only comforts in her small cage. And just to talk about that ambiguous scene at the end between her and Ethan, I figured there was an artistic reason to leave it ambiguous. And This is from, maybe there was an obvious hint that was dropped that I completely missed, but I found it 100% ambiguous, and I respect the decision to leave it like that. So I'm not going to speculate. I'm just going to leave that there. But we could draw conclusions if we figured out, what happened with that. But that's not for this video. Before we end here, I want to talk about Albie. Albie, to me, is very similar to Ethan in the sense they have no real grasp of their kingdom and their boundaries, and don't really have much of a potent warrior to defend those boundaries. I mean, maybe they do. Maybe they're probably both really hardworking. So what? They don't know where the boundaries are, so they don't know where to post their warrior to defend. So Albie more than anybody, I think, concedes on his boundaries again and again and again. Perhaps that's what Portia meant by wishing he'd raise her heart rate a little bit. Albie will simply not say what he wants or what he's thinking like he's thinking he's being a gentleman, being courteous, being patient, being diplomatic. I can identify with that. It's what the red pill in the manosphere call a nice guy syndrome. Donald Glover has a book. Donald Glover, I think. Is that his name? Oh, I'm sorry. Blinking on Glover is definitely the last name. Anyway, nice guy syndrome. And the show shows the kinds of circumstances that the nice guy kind of unintentionally, subconsciously invites into their lives by virtue of the Italian prostitutes, right? Jung said that whatever we fail to make conscious will remain unconscious, and then it will be acted out in the physical world, and we'll call it fate. Think about that in relation to Albie. Albie's a great cautionary tale about how important it is to push back or push forward with the vision we have for our lives, and to make sure there's a warrior there that can be the mover. And I like how the grandfather mentioned that they have an Achilles cock. It's funny. It implies thinking with their penis. It's the oldest thing ever told. But what it amounts to in this paradigm is a lack of the king archetype and a lack of the warrior. Like, they're failing to grasp what the vision for their life is, and they're just being led around by their dick. Not only that, even if they knew, it's almost as if they don't have the willpower to restrain it, and that's a lack of warrior. To conclude here, ultimately, the greatness, like we mentioned earlier, the greatness of an individual is largely dependent on the greatness of their king archetype, as it informs the other archetypes. Like, you can't have a healthy lover and an unhealthy king. It's impossible. Again, we're kind of out of time. There's we're scratching the surface here. I really want to know if y'all got something out of this. If y'all want me to review more media, I'm already thinking about. I already have a lot of ideas for stuff I could do. But yeah, let me know how y'all like this. Again, I'm covering all of these aspects of what I'm talking about: king, warrior, magician, lover, inflation, deflation, all this stuff. Check out my channel if you want to know all about all this stuff. And I'll catch y'all in the next one. We're out of time. Let me know what y'all think, and I hope to see y'all again. Bye-bye.